The wedding week that swallowed 22 grooms began the moment I stepped onto the Briar Hollow Road, and I felt the earth shift under my boots like something was breathing just beneath the surface, because the Georgia blood dowry sisters' 22 grooms lost during wedding week 1875 was not a superstition here but a buried wound the town never allowed to heal. Before I open that wound any further, tell me your city and the exact time you are watching, because dark history tends to reach for people at the hour it first struck. I noticed the red ribbons first. They were tied to the gate posts, the oak limbs, the porch rails, every one of them hanging too still for the wind that pushed against my coat. They looked soaked and heavy, like they had absorbed something thicker than rain. As I walked beneath them, each ribbon tightened and straightened as if pulled by an invisible hand, and the sharp snap of fabric made the back of my neck prickle. I tried convincing myself it was only the breeze, but the road behind me stayed silent and the air remained unnaturally warm. When the inn came into view, its windows were shuttered from the inside even though it was barely afternoon. The owner opened the door halfway, peered at me as if I carried a curse, and only after a long pause did she allow me inside. Her shoulders were tense, and the way she kept glancing at the doorway made me feel as though she expected someone to follow me in. She asked why I had come during wedding week. The question trembled out of her, as if the words themselves carried weight. I told her I had been sent to inspect land boundaries, that the Maddox estate had been accused of claiming acres that did not belong to them. The moment I said the name Maddox, she froze. Her hands stiffened around the pitcher she was holding, and water splashed across the wooden counter. She told me 22 men had walked through the Maddox gates for wedding week over the last decade. Every one of them dressed for marriage. Every one of them disappeared before the final night. No bodies were returned. No coffins. Only red ribbons left hanging from the front gate like the last breath of each groom. I wanted to dismiss her as fearful or superstitious, but the way her eyes glistened with something close to guilt forced me to stay silent. It felt as though she blamed herself for not stopping me, as though she had watched too many men walk the same path I was now taking. When I stepped back outside, the road was empty. Even the stray dogs that usually haunted southern towns were nowhere to be seen. I followed the dirt path leading toward the Maddox estate, and the trees on either side bent inward in a way that felt unnatural, like they had grown toward something whispering from the center of the woods. The deeper I walked, the heavier the air became. It tasted metallic, thick enough that breathing felt like swallowing warm coins. Halfway to the estate, I found a ring lying in the road. A simple gold band with initials carved inside. The edges were scratched, and the metal was dented as if someone had clutched it until their fingers bled. I set it back on the ground, unwilling to take something that felt like it belonged to the dead. As dusk began to settle, I passed a small cabin. An elderly man sat on the porch with his hat pulled low. He did not greet me. He simply lifted his chin slightly in acknowledgement and then shook his head slowly, as if telling me to turn around. His lips moved, forming words I could not hear, but the message was clear. Leave while you can. I kept walking. By the time I reached the foot of the Maddox Hill, night had wrapped itself around the estate. The house loomed above the slope, a mansion once built with wealth that had long since rotted. The windows were dark, but I could feel movement inside, a slow shifting like footsteps careful not to be heard. The front gate hung crooked, decorated with fresh red ribbons that fluttered although the air had stilled completely. Something wasn't right with the silence around the house. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that waits, the kind that listens. I stepped through the gate, and the moment my foot touched the estate grounds, the wind rose out of nowhere. The red ribbons snapped like cracking bones. The lanterns along the path flickered even though no flame should have been burning in them. The grass felt damp beneath my boots. Not with dew. With something thicker. I forced myself to keep walking toward the mansion door. With every step, the shadows seemed to shift, sliding along the walls like living things. The porch boards creaked even before I stepped on them, responding to a weight I could not see. The door opened before I touched it. Two silhouettes stood inside the threshold, tall and still. One figure stepped forward just enough for the lamplight to touch her face. Her skin was pale, her eyes dark, her expression unreadable. She looked like she had been carved rather than born. This was the first of the Maddox sisters. She smiled slowly, and it was not a greeting. It was recognition. As if she had been waiting. As if she already knew I would come. And as the door closed behind me, the house sealed me in with a final thud that echoed like a vow someone else had made on my behalf. The invitation that should have never reached me revealed itself the moment the Maddox sister stepped aside and let me enter the hallway where the air felt colder than the night outside, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The corridor stretched unnaturally long, lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes were too dark to read, painted in strokes that made every face tilted slightly downward as though judging anyone who dared to cross their home. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as though complaining about my presence, and every step echoed far too loudly for such a narrow passage. Something about that echo felt wrong. It sounded as if there were two sets of footsteps instead of one, the second pair landing a half-beat behind mine with unsettling precision. The older sister appeared at the far end of the hallway before I saw her properly. There was only the faint glimmer of a white gown slipping past the corner, gliding like fog rather than walking. When she emerged fully, she carried a sealed envelope in her hand. It was aged but unwrinkled, as though preserved intentionally, and the wax emblem matched the one on the mysterious letter that summoned me here. The way she held it made my stomach tighten. She told me I had been expected long before my arrival, though she never spoke the words aloud. She simply extended the envelope toward me with a slow elegance that felt rehearsed. When I opened it, I found a single page inside. The handwriting looked like it belonged to someone who had not lifted a pen in years, each stroke heavy and trembling, yet careful enough to ensure every curve was precise. It declared my presence necessary to settle the dowry rights and finalize the marriage agreements for the week. The message did not ask. It informed. The signature at the bottom bore a name I had never seen before, yet something in the ink felt familiar, as if I had seen it written in a place I could not recall. The date was older than it should have been, predating even the first missing groom by nearly a decade. I did not understand why I was chosen. There was no connection between me and the Maddox estate, no history, no debt owed. Yet standing in that hallway, surrounded by portraits of men whose faces looked vaguely similar to mine, I felt an uncomfortable pull that suggested the choice had never been mine. The sisters led me deeper into the house, passing through a parlor filled with wilted roses. The smell was sharp, a blend of sweetness and decay that clung to the back of my throat. In the middle of the room stood a table draped with lace that had begun to yellow. On top of it lay 22 rings spaced apart in equal distances, each resting beside a strip of red ribbon. The moment I recognized them as wedding bands, something cold pressed against my spine. Each ring looked worn, scratched, and bent, as if torn off in haste or desperation. My eyes lingered on the one I found on the road earlier, the same initials carved inside. It sat among the others as if it had been waiting to rejoin its brothers. The younger sister reached out and touched one of the ribbons so gently it barely moved. Her movements were deliberate, as though she were performing a ritual she had memorized long ago. The room seemed to lean toward her, listening. She lifted her head and looked at me with an expression that held no malice, only inevitability. She motioned for me to follow, and though every instinct screamed at me to leave, my feet carried me behind her. We reached the east wing of the estate where the windows were boarded from the inside. The boards were not new. They bowed inward slightly as though something had pressed against them from within. The hallway smelled faintly of iron and damp earth. At the end of it stood a door with deep claw-like scratches carved around the handle, as though someone or something had tried to keep that door shut rather than open it. The sisters ignored the marks and stepped past the door without hesitation. Inside the next room, I saw wedding garments placed neatly upon mannequins. 22 suits, all tailored differently but dulled with dust. The buttons were tarnished, the collars stained with a faint reddish hue. A single empty mannequin stood at the front, taller than the rest. It was positioned directly beneath a chandelier that flickered even without flame. My chest tightened as I stared at it, because it was clear that the mannequin was waiting for its new suit, its new groom, its new offering. The sisters glided around the room with a synchronized grace that made it difficult to tell where one movement ended and the other began. Their gowns brushed the floor lightly, never catching dust or snagging on anything, as if the house itself cleared their path. The older sister retrieved a measuring tape from a drawer and extended it toward me. I felt the walls close around us as she approached. The room dimmed. She measured my shoulders, my arms, my neck, with fingers cold enough to make my breath hitch. With every touch, the chandelier dimmed further until only a faint glow remained, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching hands. Once finished, she stepped back, her expression unreadable. The younger sister whispered something too soft to hear, but I felt its meaning settle over me like dust. The mannequin was no longer empty. It was mine. They escorted me out of the wing without a word, guiding me toward the grand staircase that coiled downward into a deeper part of the house. As we descended, the air grew viscous and heavy. I sensed a faint vibration beneath my boots, subtle but constant, like the steady pulse of a creature slumbering below. At the bottom of the staircase, a corridor stretched into the darkness. Narrow, unventilated, suffocating. The sisters did not step into it. They stood at the top, watching, waiting, knowing that I would walk forward even without being told. I took the first step and the shadows swallowed me whole. When I turned back, the sisters were still standing at the top of the stairs, their silhouettes still, their faces obscured by shadow. And for the first time since entering the estate, I realized something deeply wrong. They had never blinked. Not once. The sisters who wore red instead of white revealed themselves fully when I stepped into the grand hall where the mansion breathed an older air, thick with the weight of every groom who had crossed its threshold before me. The hall stretched wider than the exterior of the house suggested, as if the estate bent itself to welcome whoever entered, shaping its rooms to deepen the footsteps of its chosen. Candles burned even though no one had lit them, and the flames did not flicker. They held steady like sharp, watching eyes, glowing against the wallpaper that peeled away in long curling strips. The designs beneath the peeling paper were older, painted directly onto the wood, faded with age but still visible enough to reveal outlines of ceremonies, branches, and what looked like rows of men kneeling in front of two women draped in veils the color of blood. The sisters appeared on opposite ends of the hall at the exact same moment, moving with that same synchronized grace that made it impossible to tell who led and who followed. They had abandoned the white gowns from earlier. Their dresses were now deep crimson, long and heavy, the fabric shifting like thick liquid around their feet. The color clung to them in a way that felt deliberate, a reminder that wedding week in this house was not built on purity but on something far darker. Their veils draped from their crowns down to their waists, sheer enough to reveal the faint shapes of their faces beneath but thick enough to blur their expressions. I cannot explain why, but the sight of them made the room feel colder, as if something ancient had awakened in their presence. They circled me slowly, not touching, not speaking, but moving with an awareness that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. Every footstep they took made the chandelier above us groan softly, as though its weight shifted with them. The hall felt smaller with each pass, the walls subtly closing in, the floorboards tightening like a chest inhaling. When they finally stopped, the younger sister reached out and tapped the center of my chest gently with a single finger. A tingling sensation spread across my ribs, and when I looked down, I saw that the fabric of my shirt appeared darker, as if a faint mark had been pressed into it. She turned away before I could understand what had been done. At the far end of the hall stood an arched doorway draped with long red curtains. The older sister parted them slightly and motioned for me to follow. Behind the curtains lay a room filled with brides' relics. Not grooms' relics. Brides. Mannequins dressed in red veils stood in rows along both walls, each one positioned with perfect stillness, hands clasped, heads bowed. Their veils were stiff with age, and the fabric near their chests bore reddish stains that looked disturbingly fresh. Between the mannequins were old wedding chairs carved with initials that repeated several times. M&L for Maddox and Lenora. C&M for Cassadine and Maddox. Names intertwined in wood, yet never belonging to any groom. Only as I walked deeper did I notice something that made my stomach twist. The mannequins varied slightly in height, shape, and build. They were not all made from the same mold. Some were carved, some seemed stitched, and one appeared smooth like wax. The farther I moved, the more the air thickened, carrying a scent that reminded me faintly of iron and old perfume. The sisters followed me into the room, their veils brushing the floor like weighted curtains. The younger sister approached one of the mannequins and placed her hand flat against its chest. The air shifted instantly. The flame of every candle in the room bent toward her hand as though responding to a pull. The mannequin's veil fluttered slightly despite the air being completely still. A low hum filled the room, resonating through the wooden floor, a sound too deep to come from any human throat. When she stepped back, the mannequin remained motionless, yet something about its posture had changed. The tilt of its head. The tension in its shoulders. The angle of its hands. It looked as though it had been placed under an unseen command. The older sister approached me again, this time holding a folded piece of crimson fabric. She unfolded it slowly, revealing what could only be described as a ceremonial sash. The fabric shimmered faintly, almost breathing with each movement. She pressed it into my hands without blinking. The moment my skin touched the cloth, it felt warm, almost alive, as though the fabric pulsed softly. A chill traveled down my arms. I asked nothing. The rules of the house were clear without words. Some things were meant to be given, accepted, and worn without question. When I draped the sash across my chest, the room responded instantly. The candles flared. The boards beneath my feet tightened. The mannequins leaned ever so slightly forward, like an audience silently acknowledging a performer. The sisters stepped back in perfect unison, their veiled faces turning toward one another. And though they said nothing, the air between them shimmered faintly, like a silent conversation passing without sound. They led me out of the relic room and into a long corridor that descended deeper into the mansion. The walls were made of stone now, colder and rougher, and the torches along the way burned with flames that moved in unnatural patterns. I felt the house shift as we walked, as though its foundation breathed with us, inhaling when we inhaled, exhaling when we exhaled. At the bottom of the corridor stood a massive set of double doors carved with scenes I did not recognize. Two sisters standing over kneeling men. Trees bending toward a ritual circle. Flames rising around an altar. The doors opened slowly as if pushed by a force from behind. Beyond them lay the sanctuary where the red veil ceremony was held. The air inside was colder. The shadows deeper. The ritual older than the house itself. And as the sisters stepped into the sanctuary, their veils lifted slightly as though welcoming something I could not yet see. The grooms who walked in but never walked out haunted the sanctuary the moment I stepped across its threshold, because the room felt less like a chamber and more like a vault that held the last breaths of every man who had stood where I stood now. The air was painfully still, thick enough that each inhale tasted like stone dust and wilted roses. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into a darkness that the torches could not touch. Their flames bent inward, as if drawn toward some unseen core at the center of the room. The floor was an intricate mosaic, its tiles shaped into spiraling rings that converged toward a raised platform. At first glance the rings looked decorative, but the longer I stared, the more I realized they were shaped like pathways. Ritual paths. Steps walked again and again by the men who came before me. The platform itself held the remnants of something resembling an altar. It was carved from blackened wood that had swollen and cracked with time. Deep grooves cut across its surface gave the impression of claw marks. The edges were stained darker than the center. Not fresh. Not recent. But old enough to shimmer with an oily residue when the torchlight glanced across it. It was impossible not to imagine how many hands had gripped the sides in desperation. Impossible not to consider how many had been forced to lie upon it. The sisters stood at opposite ends of the altar, one facing me, the other facing the shadowed rear wall. Their crimson veils glowed faintly and their stillness made the room feel colder. The younger sister raised her hand and motioned for me to approach the altar. Her movement was neither gentle nor threatening. It was simply expected. The house seemed to lean in with her, waiting for me to obey. As I stepped closer, I noticed carvings etched into the stone surrounding the platform. They were initials arranged in two patterns. One ring held the initials of brides. The other held those of grooms. But the groom circle was incomplete, missing pieces as if some initials had been forcibly scraped away. Only fragments remained, broken letters hinting at names that could no longer be fully read. The pattern had a rhythm, a progression, and the space left open in the groom circle sat directly across from where the sisters stood. That empty place felt like a mouth waiting to speak my name. The older sister lowered her head slightly and extended her hand toward a narrow wooden chest resting near the base of the platform. The lid slid open on its own, revealing a series of books bound in fading leather. Their pages looked brittle, some curled at the edges like dried leaves. One book lay separate from the rest, placed carefully atop the others with a ribbon tied around it. The ribbon was red, but darker, as though something had soaked into it long ago. She retrieved it and set it on the altar, then stepped aside. I realized this book did not belong to the estate. It belonged to the missing grooms. The handwriting that covered the pages varied wildly. Some scrawled in panic, others calm and elegant, others barely legible. It was a record not written by the sisters but by the men who had been invited or dragged into the ritual. A ledger of 22 stories cut short. The first page held only a single line. When you enter this room, the house already knows your end. The second page was stained and smeared, the ink running down in streaks that formed lines like tear tracks. The groom who wrote it described the first night's ritual. Not violent. Not bloody. Not yet. The sisters had circled him the same way they circled me. They had pressed their fingers to his chest the way the younger sister had done to me. They had given him a sash just like mine. He described feeling watched by the mannequins in the relic room, seeing their veils twitch without wind, hearing soft footsteps behind him that did not belong to any living person. He wrote of a voice he could not name whispering from somewhere inside the walls. He wrote that the sisters never blinked. He wrote that on the second night he had tried to run. The house had shifted. The hallways had changed shape. The doors had vanished. He ran for hours without ever reaching the threshold. The last entry from that groom was abrupt, for words carved so deeply into the page that they tore through. Do not lie down. I closed the book and felt the air thicken. The sisters watched me with unblinking stillness. I wondered how many grooms had stood here reading the same warning, all of them understanding too late that the message was not metaphor but literal survival. The younger sister stepped closer and brushed the side of the altar with her fingertips. The torches dimmed. The temperature dropped sharply, turning my breath into vapor. The mosaic tiles beneath my boots began to vibrate, faint but undeniable, as if something ancient stirred beneath them. She lifted her hand to her own chest and pressed it lightly, and for a moment I saw the faint outline of a mark beneath her gown. The same shape she had pressed onto my shirt earlier. A mark of selection. A mark of claim. The older sister motioned me toward the altar again. I remained where I was. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I sensed movement behind me though no one stood there. The shadows felt thicker, gathering weight, forming suggestions of shapes that did not belong to living men. I forced my gaze forward, away from the dark corners pressing against my spine. The sisters stepped together now, each placing a hand at opposite ends of the altar. The wood creaked. The grooves in its surface seemed to pulse. Then the platform shifted slightly, rising no more than an inch, yet enough to reveal that something beneath it pushed upward. A breath escaped from underneath, a slow exhale like air expelled from lungs too old to hold shape. The floor trembled. For the first time the sisters moved out of perfect synchrony. The younger one tilted her head, almost curiously, as if studying whether I would break. The older one's veil fluttered faintly as though something breathed behind it. The altar rose another inch. The shape beneath it pressed upward, more defined now. Not human. Not animal. Something else. Something older. Something that required grooms. The realization hit me with sudden clarity. The grooms were not sacrificed to the sisters. The sisters were merely the ones who delivered them. Something beneath the house demanded the dowry. Something hungry. The platform trembled again, louder this time, and dust drifted from the ceiling like falling ash. And in that shaking moment, the truth settled in my bones with a cold, merciless certainty. The 22 men did not vanish. They were claimed. And I had just become the next offering. The dowry that demanded flesh not gold revealed itself the moment the altar dropped back into place with a deep thud that rippled through the sanctuary floor like the final heartbeat of something buried alive. The vibration crawled up my legs and settled in my ribs, leaving a hollow ache that made every breath feel borrowed. The sisters stepped away from the altar slowly, and the air around them shifted with a quiet reverence, as if the house bowed to them for completing the first stage of the ritual. Their crimson veils glowed faintly in the low torchlight, almost pulsing as though the fabric fed on the energy released from the altar's awakening. I stood frozen, trying to force my mind to grasp what I had seen under the platform. The shape had not been clear, yet its presence had been undeniable, a mass of movement without form, weight without shape, an ancient hunger that pressed upward with intention. It was the center of the estate, the heart of the dowry, the reason no groom walked out after wedding week ended. The sisters were not brides in the traditional sense. They were keepers. Offers. The last living descendants bound to maintain a ritual older than their bloodline. The younger sister moved toward me, her steps echoing softly on the stone. With each step, the sash she had given me tightened subtly across my chest, constricting in a way that felt alive. I placed a hand over it and felt a faint pulse throb beneath the fabric, as if the sash had become a second skin sinking itself to my heartbeat. She reached toward my face, her fingertips cold enough to sting my jaw, and traced a slow line across my cheek. When she stepped back, my skin burned as if branded by touch alone. The older sister raised her hands, and the torches around the sanctuary dimmed simultaneously. The shadows grew heavier, pooling along the walls and gathering behind the altar in a shape that hinted at movement. The air thickened again, carrying a subtle vibration that pressed against my ears until the silence felt deafening. Slowly, she turned and led me toward a narrow archway at the back of the sanctuary, one I had not noticed earlier. The archway descended into a lower chamber, its steps worn smooth by countless feet. I felt the weight of 22 men behind me, their unseen footsteps overlapping in my mind as I followed the sisters downward. The staircase spiraled, the air cooling with each step, and by the time we reached the bottom, my breath fogged faintly in front of me. The chamber was wider than I expected, carved into the earth itself, the walls rough and damp, lit only by a series of oil lamps arranged in a circle. In the center of the chamber stood a stone basin filled with a dark liquid that shimmered like thick ink. The sisters positioned themselves on opposite sides of the basin, their veils lifting slightly in an unseen breeze. They extended their hands toward the liquid, and it trembled. Not from heat. Not from movement. From awareness. I stepped closer unwillingly, as though the floor guided my feet instead of my own choices. The closer I got, the more I realized the basin was not filled with water or oil but with something thicker that carried the faint metallic scent I had detected since entering the house. The scent of blood mixed with time. The older sister dipped her fingertips into the basin, and the liquid reacted instantly, swirling into a spiral pattern that matched the mosaic in the sanctuary above. The younger sister motioned for me to place my hand into the basin. The air around her gesture tightened, as if the chamber itself expected obedience. I hesitated only a moment because there was no choice to make. My hand lowered into the liquid, and a rush of cold shot up my arm, piercing bone and numbing muscle. It felt as though something ancient reached through the blood, curling around my wrist with the curiosity of a creature tasting its next offering. When I pulled my hand out, my palm bore a mark that matched the shape the younger sister had pressed onto my chest hours earlier. A symbol of binding. A symbol of completion. The sisters stepped back, their veils drifting like smoke, and the liquid calmed instantly, settling into perfect stillness. The chamber's walls vibrated in response, a deep resonance like a creature purring in satisfaction. It echoed faintly around me until it felt like the sound seeped directly into my veins. The younger sister guided me out of the chamber and into another corridor I had not noticed before. This one smelled faintly of soil and wilted flowers. Its wooden beams were carved with dozens of initials, each paired with a date. Some of the carvings were recent enough for the wood fibers to still appear raw and pale, while others were almost erased by time. As I walked, I traced my fingers across the carvings, and each pair of initials felt like a heartbeat trapped in the wall. My touch lingered on the most recent entry, the date only days old. Then I saw an empty space. Smooth wood. Untouched. Waiting. The anticipation in the wood felt almost alive, like the corridor itself leaned toward my mark. The sisters continued walking until the corridor opened into a room lit by a single hanging lantern. In the center rested a long table covered in linens embroidered with the same symbol now marked on my palm. At the far end stood another mannequin, but this one wore no gown and bore no veil. It stood bare, its surface smooth and pale, shaped in the form of a man, yet its face was unfinished, blank and waiting. A hollow outline. The faintest suggestion of features. Waiting for definition. Waiting for a groom. The older sister pressed her hand against the mannequin's chest, and her veil lifted slightly as if responding to a sigh of anticipation. The younger sister placed her hand on my shoulder, her grip surprisingly firm, and guided me closer to it. The blank face tilted slightly, not by her touch but by its own accord. It turned toward me with a silent curiosity, as though trying to imagine my shape, my expression, my final place among the others. The truth became painfully clear. The dowry did not claim grooms simply to kill them. It repurposed them, reshaped them, turned them into guardians, witnesses, offerings frozen in place to uphold a ritual that fed the thing beneath the estate. And as the mannequin's hollow face shifted closer to mine, the sisters stepped away in perfect unison, leaving me in the center of the room with the silent expectation of what I would become. The dowry had chosen. I was the next body carved into the foundation of their legacy. The night the blood dowry ritual finally broke began with the sound of the mannequin taking its first silent breath, a shift so faint it could have been imagined, yet the movement rippled through the floorboards like a warning. The lantern above flickered once, the flame bending toward the blank face as if recognizing something within it. The sisters stood in the corners of the room, their crimson veils lifting in an unseen current that spiraled around them like threads of smoke. They watched without blinking as the mannequin leaned closer, its unfinished features gliding toward my own as though it sought to mirror me. The air tightened in my lungs. Every instinct urged me to step back, but the cold grip of the younger sister on my shoulder had not fully released, and even after she withdrew, the phantom of her touch held me in place. The mannequin tilted its head as though studying my hesitation, and its faceless expression shimmered, the surface rippling the way warm wax shifts before solidifying. The sisters moved in unison toward the edge of the room, sliding their hands along the carved symbols that lined the walls. As their palms passed over each mark, the wood glowed faintly, a soft red pulse rising beneath their touch. The glow spread upward toward the ceiling, creating a web of faint lines above us that connected the room like a map of veins. The marks responded like old memories reawakened. I felt the air vibrate with the faint hum of voices layered upon one another, the echo of 22 men murmuring somewhere just beneath the surface of hearing, trapped but not silent. The mannequin's faceless surface continued to shift. Its chest expanded subtly as if drawing breath more confidently now. Its arms cracked at the joints the way old branches shift under unseen pressure. I felt its breathless presence lean toward me, the hollow face stretching toward familiarity. It was trying to copy me. It was learning me. And once it finished, I knew it would take the place I stood in and I would be forced into the walls of this house the way the other grooms had been, preserved as relics, trapped as witnesses, fed to the dowry piece by piece. The younger sister stepped behind the mannequin and placed her hand upon its back. The statue shuddered, responding instantly as if she were its heartbeat. The older sister stepped closer to me, her veil brushing my arm like a cold whisper. She reached for my sash, gripping it at the center where the fabric pressed against the symbol burned onto my chest. With a single sharp pull, she tightened it until the mark beneath my skin pulsed with unbearable heat. The room spun for a moment, and I felt something tug at my rib cage, an invisible thread pulling me toward the mannequin. The walls throbbed with a dull tremor. The voices of the past grooms rose louder, growing into a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. The mannequin reached out its arm, and though its hand was unformed, the gesture was unmistakable. It wanted mine. It wanted to complete the ritual. It wanted to take the form the sisters had chosen for it. As it leaned forward, I felt the air between us tighten like stretched fabric ready to tear. I stepped back instinctively, but the sash constricted further, anchoring me to the spot. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots. The entire house seemed to shift, adjusting itself to prevent my escape. Then a sound echoed from the corridor behind me. A faint tapping. Not footsteps. Not scratching. A deliberate knock, steady and slow. 3 taps. Silence. 3 taps again. The sisters turned sharply, their veils twitching as though tugged by an invisible force. Their attention broke from me for the first time since entering the room. The mannequin froze mid-movement, its hollow face tilted upward as if listening. The knock came again, louder this time. The corridor lights dimmed. The tapping continued, pacing itself in a rhythm far too controlled to be accidental. I forced myself to turn toward the door, expecting one of the townspeople or perhaps the echo of a groom who had managed to resist longer than the others. But the door remained shut, the wood vibrating with each knock. Something pressed against it from the other side, not with force but with intent. The older sister hissed under her veil, a sound low and sharp that vibrated through the room. The younger sister raised her hands, palms outward, directing her focus toward the door. The wood bowed inward slightly, resisting whatever pushed from the other side. The lantern flickered violently, shadows twisting into shapes that moved like figures rushing past the walls. The symbols carved into the wood glowed brighter, the room thickening with a pressure that made my ears ring. Without warning, the mannequin jerked to the side as though struck. Its torso twisted unnaturally, its limbs cracking in sharp angles before straightening again. Something had disturbed it. Something had interrupted the ritual. I felt the sash loosen slightly around my chest, and the mark beneath my skin pulsed in response. A crack appeared along the mannequin's shoulder, thin at first, then widening. The surface split with a sound like tearing bark. Beneath the pale exterior, something darker glimmered, as though the statue contained layers waiting to be exposed. The tapping turned into pounding. The door shook violently. The sisters moved in a sudden wave of motion, rushing toward the entrance. Their veils snapped like heavy wings caught in a storm. A gust of air blasted through the room even though no window had opened, extinguishing half the lamps instantly. Darkness swallowed the edges of the chamber, leaving only the faint glow of the marked carvings and the flicker of the remaining lantern. The pounding stopped. Silence replaced it. A silence so absolute it felt like a living thing crouched just beyond the door, waiting. The sisters stood motionless, their veils lifted by a breath that did not belong to the living. The mannequin turned its head sharply toward the silence, its faceless surface rippling with agitation. A crack spread down its chest like a vein of lightning. Then the door burst inward as if struck by a force from within the house itself, not the outside. The wood splintered. Dust exploded into the room. A cold wind blew through the corridor, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of the dowry chamber. The sisters recoiled, not in fear but in recognition. Something had awakened deeper in the house, something they had not intended to stir so soon. The mannequin lunged suddenly, not at the sisters but toward me, desperate to complete what had been interrupted. I stumbled back, the sash tightening again as if trying to drag me forward. The room shook violently, dust raining from the ceiling. The shadows deepened, stretching long like arms reaching for the altar. The walls trembled as though something beneath them crawled upward. The ritual was breaking. The house was waking. And whatever had come crashing through that door had come for me, not to claim me, but to stop what the sisters intended. The 23rd groom was no longer willing to go quietly. The only groom who lived long enough to tell it began the moment the mannequin crashed toward me with the sound of splitting bone and shattering clay, its hollow form collapsing into fragments that scattered across the ritual floor like pieces of a broken vow. The sash around my chest pulsed violently as if fighting to keep the ritual intact, tightening until my ribs felt close to cracking. The sisters lunged toward me in unison, their crimson veils sweeping through the dust-filled air like bleeding wings, but the force that had burst through the corridor kept pushing into the room, bending the walls with a pressure that made the torches pop one by one. The darkness that replaced the flames moved with intent. It was not emptiness. It was presence. The sisters stumbled backward for the first time since I entered the estate, their perfect synchrony fracturing as the unseen force surged again, sweeping across the floor like a violent exhale from beneath the foundation. The wooden boards groaned and split, revealing thin cracks that widened as the darkness pooled through them like liquid shadow. The house was not breaking. It was opening. The force that had answered the door was not a rescuer. It was the same thing the sisters had fed for generations, now rising without their command. The Dowry spirit, the ancient hunger, the reason 22 men vanished and why the earth shivered when I arrived. The creature under the estate had awakened early, drawn not by the sisters' ritual, but by the breaking of it. The sisters moved rapidly, their veils snapping like fabric caught in lightning. The younger one gestured sharply, and the shattered mannequin pieces trembled across the floor, rearranging into something more coherent, more alive, crawling toward the center of the room. The older sister raised her hands and the carvings along the walls ignited in a deep red glow, casting the chamber in pulsing light that beat like a heart. The house responded instantly, the floors lifting and sinking as though the estate itself were breathing in panic. For the first time, I heard the sisters make a sound that resembled fear, a low rasp that escaped beneath their veils as the spirit rose through the cracks in the floor. Its form was not physical. It was movement without shape, a distortion of reality that bent the space around it. The shadows pulled inward like water swirling down a drain, forming a spiraling mass of darkness with faint outlines of hands, faces, and remnants of the 22 men threaded through its depths. They were not lost. They were inside it, their presence whispering through the air like echoes of unfinished vows. I felt them brush against my mind, flashes of their final moments searing through my thoughts, each one showing the sisters guiding them to the ritual, binding them, offering them, and watching them be swallowed. The spirit lunged toward the altar, its hunger dragging across the room like a gale of cold wind, ripping the linens and extinguishing the last remaining lamp. The chamber plunged into near blackness except for the pulse of the wall markings and the faint glow of the shattered mannequin reforming itself. The sisters fought to contain the rising force, their veils whipping violently as the darkness clawed at their gowns. Their movements grew frantic, no longer graceful, as if centuries of control were slipping through their fingers. Then the darkness turned toward me. Not because it wanted to kill me. Because I was marked. The symbol burned beneath my skin, the sash constricting in response as though offering me to it. The spirit surged forward, the room bending inward, the floor curling like a wave beneath my boots. I stumbled backward as the sisters screamed silently beneath their veils, rushing to intercept the creature. But the darkness ignored them. It knew I was the next groom. It knew the ritual was incomplete. It needed to claim me. The sash tightened one last time so fiercely I felt the veins in my neck strain. The mark on my palm flared in searing heat. The darkness reeled back as if ready to strike. But the broken mannequin reached me first. Its cracked arm shot upward not to bind me but to pull the sash apart. Its jagged fingers hooked beneath the fabric and tore it in a single brutal motion. The sash ripped with a sound like a shriek. The mark beneath my skin dimmed instantly. The binding broke. The spirit froze. The sisters froze. For the first time the house fell silent. The mannequin collapsed again, its final act completed. The sisters stared at me with a mixture of fury and disbelief, their ritual unraveling in their hands. The spirit twisted, rising sharper, hungrier, furious at being denied its offering. It turned on the sisters, and the room erupted in violent force. The walls cracked. The altar shattered. The torches exploded, sending shards of metal across the floor. The darkness surged toward the sisters, wrapping around them like a storm. Their veils tore away, vanishing into the swirling mass. They did not scream. They simply dissolved into the darkness as though they were never separate from it. The chamber collapsed piece by piece as the spirit devoured the ritual that once bound it. The entire estate groaned, shaking violently, the ceilings shedding beams and plaster. I ran toward the staircase, stumbling through the crumbling hall as portraits fell from the walls and red ribbons unraveled in the air like frantic signals. The floor buckled behind me, entire sections dropping into a void filled with swirling shadows. I reached the front door just as the spirit roared through the house, a sound made from the combined breaths of the 22 men trapped inside it. I dove through the threshold as the estate imploded, sinking into itself as if swallowed by the earth. The hill cracked open and the mansion folded inward, collapsing into darkness until nothing remained but dust and silence. The spirit's howl echoed one final time, then faded into the soil beneath Briar Hollow. The ground sealed itself, leaving no trace of the estate that once fed it. I'm the only groom who lived. The mark on my chest faded by morning. The town refused to speak to me. No one ventured near the hill again. But some nights, when the wind crawls across the fields, I hear 22 voices murmuring beneath the ground, waiting for the sisters who will never return and the ritual that finally broke because I did not kneel. And if you want more stories carved from the darkest corners of history, subscribe and like to keep them rising from the ground.